Chapter 1 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April H. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown, Chapter 1. The Brown Cottage. Lucy and Dora Merrill lived in a little brown cottage on the corner of the main street of a New England town. Across from the house was a drugstore. In November, when the nights grew cold, the druggist put hot water bottles in his window so the passerby would think how comfortable one would feel tucked into bed near his toes when the holidays were coming. The window showed boxes of candy and bright holly berries. When it was time to clean house, mothballs and camphor reminded people to put away their muffs and winter clothes. But when this story begins, it was early summer, and the window held a number of sherbet glasses filled with soft white stuff, like that on Christmas trees, with red cherries on top. Lucy and Dora considered this quite the most delightful display the druggist had ever shown. On the other corner of the street stood a long, low brick building, used as a printing office. The children's father was foreman of the printing room. Nearest its big windows was a wonderful machine, into one end of which a man fed blank pieces of paper. At the other end they came out as neatly printed and folded pamphlets. The children sometimes saw their father directing one or another of the dozen busy working men, or sometimes he was seated at the big linotype machines across the room, a machine which Lucy and Dora believed could almost think for itself. It did such wonderful things. Each of the little girls owned a thin metal strip forming a single line of print made by this machine. Lucy's strip had her name, Lucy S. Merrill, and Dora's read, Dora Merrill. The letters on these strips were all backwards, so as to make it read the right way when the type was used for printing. You will see how this must be if you hold a book up to a mirror. The children also owned an indelible ink pad, and they used these metal strips to mark their names on their underclothes and handkerchiefs. Farther down the street were more shops, and then the country began again until it came to a big city a few miles off. And where Main Street stretched away on the other side of the Brown Cottage, there were some doctors' offices, 2 garages, a church, and some beautiful big houses all the way up a long hill. Lucy and Dora went to that church, and one reason why they liked it was because their Uncle Dan sang in its choir. All along the 2 streets, which the children could see from the Brown Cottage, were great elms, and the houses were not packed tightly together, but stood apart in little yards with pretty flower beds. Farther up the hill, around the big houses, the gardens were very lovely indeed. The Merrill cottage had been built a long time. Over 100 years ago, it was a farmhouse, and the smooth, wide street before it was only a narrow country road. When you went into the cottage, it was into the tiniest hall ever seen, only about a yard square. There was just space to step in, and then one really had to shut the door immediately, so there would be room to go somewhere else. The ceiling was so low that even a person who wasn't very tall could easily touch it. Directly before the entrance rose a stair so steep that going up was like climbing a ladder, and this stair led to 2 rooms, one where Lucy and Dora slept, and the other belonging to Uncle Dan. On the walls of this entry, the paper showed gay little landscape pictures of a ship with all the sails spread, a castle before which walked ladies in queer old-fashioned dresses, and a park with deer and swans. This paper was as old as the house, and Mrs. Merrill was very proud of it. On opening the door at the left of the little square hall, you found yourself in the parlor, where the floor was painted dark green and the walls covered with a pretty pink and white paper. At the 3 windows hung clean muslin curtains, and while the furniture was rather shabby and worn, it was the kind that looked as though people enjoyed using it. The stove that heated the parlor was queer but nice, for it was not made of metal, but of gray soapstone, and was open all across the front, so it was just like having a fire on a hearth. Once a man who came to see Mr. Merrill on business wanted to buy that stove, and offered him a perfectly new, shiny iron, one in its place, but Mr. Merrill would not sell it. On cold nights he liked to sit before it and pop corn for the little girls. Besides the stove, the room contained a piano and a case full of books. The piano was there because everybody in the family liked to gather around it and sing, and the books because Mr. Merrill liked them and wanted the children to have them to read. He was also very particular about their spelling. Being a printer, he understood that it makes a good deal of trouble if you put into a word a letter which doesn't belong there, or for that matter, leave one out. From the parlor, a door opened into the kitchen, which was always warm and sunny whenever the sun shone. From the kitchen, you could also step into the wee front hall through a door under the stairs. The last door in this hall opened into the bedroom, where Mr. and Mrs. Merrill slept. At the top of the cellar stairs was another tiny entry where the refrigerator lived and where Lucy and Dora kept their gardening tools. Behind the parlor and opening from the kitchen was the bathroom, and if this seems to you a queer place to put a bathroom, you must remember that this was a very old house, and as Mrs. Merrill said, it was much better to have a bath in an inconvenient place than to have none at all. End of Chapter 1. Recording by April H.
Chapter 2 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JKitty76. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 2. How Dora Came to Live with Lucy. Most little girls are very anxious to have a baby brother or sister, and most of them, when the wish comes true, are surprised that the baby isn't big enough or strong enough to play. But after the first disappointment, there are nice things about having anyone so little and cunning and helpless to love, when another surprise comes very soon, when the baby, in its turn, begins to love back. And so Big Sister forgets how much she wanted somebody to play dolls or ball with her. Strange to say, Lucy Merrill was one of the very few little girls who didn't have this experience. Her sister came to her just the right size. It was 4 years ago when Dora came, but Lucy remembered very well the September morning when she saw a big red automobile standing before the drugstore across the street. A great many cars stopped there during the day, but this one attracted Lucy's attention. To begin with, it was unusually large and fast, and of a bright red color, which was enough to make it conspicuous anywhere. And afterwards, Uncle Dan said that it looked like the chariot of fire in the Bible. He and Lucy spoke of it by that name. Its dusty appearance showed that it had traveled a long way, and at the back, strapped on tightly, were 4 extra tires. Lucy had never before seen a car with more than 2. Along both running boards were fitted curious cases like trunks, and inside were 2 large leather suitcases. The number on the rear showed that the car came from California. Everyone who passed the automobile glanced curiously at it, but Lucy was most interested in a pretty little girl about 4 years old who sat in front, alone except for her doll. When Lucy first saw the car, the little girl was evidently tired of waiting. She twisted and turned and wriggled in the seat, and finally stood up, looking around as though hoping to find somebody she knew. Lucy slipped out of her yard and ran across the street. The little girl gazed at her seriously, and then held out her doll for Lucy to see. Lucy climbed on the running board, and the 2 looked at each other. "What is her name?" Lucy asked. "Just Jane," said the little girl. "Mine is Susie Mary Pretty," said Lucy. "Let me see her?" asked the little girl. Lucy ran over to her house to get Susan Mary, and when she came back, the druggist was standing by the car. Lucy knew him very well. He often gave her peppermints. "Look here, Lucy," he said as soon as she came out. "Do you want to take this little girl over to your house for an hour or so? The man she came with is sick." "Yes, please, Mr. Giddings," said Lucy. "Do you want to go with Lucy and see her toys?" Mr. Giddings asked of the little girl. "What's your name, honey?" "Dora," said the child, immediately holding out her hands to be lifted from the car. Mr. Giddings set her gently on her feet. "There, you run along with Lucy," he said. "Lucy, you tell your mother that the gentleman who drove the car is here in the store, and he's so sick he can't tend to anything just now. You keep the baby over there till he feels better." When Lucy brought the little girl into the clean kitchen where her mother was cooking, Mrs. Merrill looked at them kindly. "Take off her coat and bonnet, Lucy," she said, "and then you may butter 2 slices of bread and fill 2 glasses with milk." Lucy took off the little white hat and blue silk coat and looked admiringly at the pretty white frock underneath. "Come here, Dora," said Mrs. Merrill, "and I'll wipe the dust off your face and hands." All that morning the red car stood outside the drugstore, and when Mr. Merrill came home for dinner, his wife sent him to ask Mr. Giddings what the trouble was. Lucy was afraid that Dora would have to leave, but her father came back looking rather serious. "Guess we'll have company for dinner," he said as he opened the door. "Bring a box, Lucy, for you to sit on, and let this little lady have your high chair." After dinner, Dora took a nap on the sofa, and woke rested to play with Lucy. At about 5, Lucy saw the big automobile going slowly down the street. She thought it odd that the man at the wheel should be Mr. Waterman, the tall policeman who usually stood in the square, but just then her father came out of the drugstore. After talking a minute with Mr. Giddings, he crossed to his own house, and in his hand was one of the suitcases which had been in the red car. Lucy was too small herself, and too delighted to have a playmate to think it odd that the suitcase was brought up into her room, and that presently her mother took from it a little nightdress and began to undress Dora. All Lucy cared about was that the little girl was tucked into her bed to spend the night. Now Lucy knew that the sick man who came into the drugstore for help did not get well. The policemen in Massachusetts and California tried to find out about Dora, but all they could learn was that the man who owned the car was James Brent. When he left his home in California, there was no child with him, and nobody with whom the police could get in touch had any idea who Dora was, nor how she chanced to be traveling in eastern Massachusetts with Mr. Brent. Dora herself could tell nothing. She did not even know her last name. The little garments in the suitcase were all of fine material and beautifully made, but quite unmarked, and the child talked only of Mrs. Katy, Cousin Jim, and Rover, with occasional demands to be taken into the big car. For a long time, people tried hard to find out who Dora was, but nobody could tell them. She stayed on and on at Lucy's house, and after a while, it seemed that she had always been there. Nobody remembered now that her real name wasn't Merrill, and it wasn't often that Lucy's parents remembered that she wasn't their own child. So warm a place did little Dora make for herself in their hearts. She was a sunny, affectionate little thing who at once made herself one of the family and claimed a share of their love. End of Chapter 2. Recording by JKD76.
Chapter 3 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 3. The Sunday School Picnic. On the day our story really begins, Lucy woke very early, even before the first electric car came down the hill, which it usually did about 6. But the sun was already up, and none of the robins had sore throats. If they had, they couldn't possibly have been singing so hard. Lucy listened to the birds just for that one sleepy moment before she was really wide awake. But the very instant she knew that the night was gone, she jumped out of bed and ran to the open window. Yes, the day was to be pleasant. Down Elm Street she could see how fresh and green Mr. Sharp's garden looked. Every leaf was wet with dew, and the sunlight fell in slanting lines, which made it seem prettier than at noon. Lucy drew a long breath of satisfaction. This was the day chosen for the Sunday school picnic, and had the sky been acting like a watering pot, a good many children in Westmore would have been disappointed. "Is it pleasant?" Dora asked sleepily. "Yes," said Lucy, "and we'd better get up. We must help Mother pack the lunch." In a second, Dora was awake and out of bed. The two began to dress in the clean garments laid ready the night before, but the white frocks were not to go on because accidents sometimes happen when an excited little girl is eating breakfast just before starting on a picnic. "Besides," said Lucy, "we wouldn't want to leave the dishes for Mother to do, and we couldn't wash them in our white dresses." Dora agreed. She was putting on her stockings with great care that the seams should run straight up the back, not twist disgracefully around her slim little legs. Dora was only 8, and Lucy, being 9, was fussy, as older sisters often are, about the way Dora's clothes looked. Lucy was brushing her hair. It really was much harder to manage than Dora's because curly hair snarls worse than straight hair. Dora's was cut short at her neck, and all she had to do was run a comb through it, and tie the longest lock with a ribbon on top. This took 2 minutes, while Lucy had to spend at least 10 on hers. If she didn't, Uncle Dan would tease her by pretending it was a bird's nest and reciting a rhyme he had found in a book. There was an old man who said, "Hush! I perceived a young bird in this bush. When asked where is it, I said I can't see it. It's 4 times as big as the bush." Lucy didn't consider this at all funny, and Dora, who did think it a joke, couldn't decide what it meant. When she asked Uncle Dan, he said he didn't write it, so he couldn't be expected to know. This picnic morning, Dora's stockings went on as nicely as anyone could wish, and Lucy's curls fell meekly into place. Both looked happy as they put on their old gingham dresses and ran down to the kitchen where Mrs. Merrill was busy. "Dora, set the table," she said, "and Lucy, bring the butter and milk from the refrigerator." Mrs. Merrill smiled as she spoke, and whisked open the oven door for a peep inside. A delicious, spicy smell came out. "Mother's making cookies," Dora sang. "Mother's making cookies." "Yes, for your lunch, Dora, child. Be quick. Father and Uncle Dan must have breakfast." Dora stopped dancing and flew madly about the table, putting forks and plates and spoons in place. The table was covered with a white cloth and stood near the screen door opening on the backyard. A green grass plot formed the center, and flowers bordered the grass. Uncle Dan and Lucy and Dora took care of the flowers. On a June morning, it was pleasant to eat breakfast and look out at bees and butterflies making early visits to the Shirley poppies. When Lucy had brought the butter and milk from the refrigerator, she helped Dora finish setting up the table. Everything was ready when Father and Uncle Dan came in. Uncle Dan had been out to get a morning paper. "Pity about your picnic, Lucy," he said solemnly. Uncle Dan was always joking. "Heavy snow and extreme cold, followed by high winds." "Snow?" gasped Lucy, quite horrified. "Uncle Dan," laughed Dora, "does it say so in the paper?" "Doesn't it?" teased Uncle Dan, holding the paper so she could not reach it. "Oh, I made a mistake. That was for December 28th. This is June, isn't it?" Lucy's face again became smiling, and Dora looked over Uncle Dan's shoulder long enough to see that the weather corner of the paper said, "Continued fair. Not much change in temperature." After breakfast, Mr. Merrill kissed the little girls and gave them each a 25-cent piece. "To spend just as you like," he said, "for candy or popcorns, whatever you choose." "They don't need it, John," said Mrs. Merrill. "The Sunday school provides the car and ice cream, and they'll have their lunch." "Dora will find a use for it," said Mr. Merrill as he shut the screen door behind him. Then Uncle Dan went to his work, and he gave them each a shining dime. "They'll both be sick tomorrow, Dan," said Mrs. Merrill, but she smiled as she saw how pleased the children were. After the dishes were washed, Lucy and Dora made their bed and Uncle Dan's bed, and then it was time to put on the white dresses. Mrs. Merrill brushed their hair and tied their ribbons, a red one for Lucy with her dark curls and brown eyes, and a blue one for Dora's fair hair to match her eyes. "Do we look nice, Mother?" Dora asked when they were ready. "If you behave as well as you look, nobody will find any fault with you," said Mrs. Merrill. "Now, remember, Dora and Lucy, you must be little ladies. I don't want anybody to think my little girls don't know how to behave themselves properly. Do everything Miss Page tells you, and if you see anybody who gets left out of the games, try to make her feel happy. You must help the others have a good time too, you know. You each have more lunch than you can possibly eat, so offer Miss Page some of your cookies. And if there's any child who didn't bring enough, go shares." The Sunday school was to have special cars in the square at 8:30. It was only a quarter after when Lucy and Dora reached the place, But the cars were on the track, and ever so many children were already seated or standing in groups. "There's Miss Page!" exclaimed Lucy, happily, catching sight of the teacher to whose class she and Dora belonged. "Good morning, Lucy. Good morning, Dora," said Miss Page, as she saw their happy faces. "Isn't it a lovely day?" "Lucy, come in with me," called Alice Harper. "There's room on this seat for both you and Dora." "Yes, jump in there," said Miss Page. "All my class is together, and everybody has come but Mildred." Lucy and Dora climbed aboard the car. There were 8 little girls in Miss Page's class, and they all thought they had the very nicest teacher in the whole Sunday school. Besides Lucy and Dora, there were Mildred Monroe, Alice Harper, Mary Barrows, Gladys Parr, Iris Whitman, and Grace Benson. Alice and Grace lived in big houses on the hill, and their fathers went every day to business in Boston. Mary's father kept a little shoe store in Main Street. Gladys's father worked in the cotton mill. Iris had no father, and Mrs. Whitman went out washing for people or helping them scrub and clean their houses. She worked very hard to keep a home for Iris and the 3 younger children. Iris could not always come to Sunday school, and she could hardly ever stop to play after school because she had to look out for the children while her mother was working. Mildred's father was a conductor on the railroad, and Mildred and her mother could go into Boston whenever they wished without paying any fare because Mr. Monroe had a pass for his family. The other girls thought this a wonderful privilege, but Mildred did not get taken to Boston very often. Before long, Mr. Thorne, who was the rector of the church, came into the square, and when they saw him, all Miss Page's girls began to giggle, partly because they were so happy, and partly because they had never seen Mr. Thorne dressed as he was. He didn't look as he did on Sundays. He didn't look like their minister at all, for he wore a flannel shirt, tennis shoes, and bright blue tie, and an old gray suit. Clearly, Mr. Thorne was going on a picnic, and probably it was as festive for him to get into old clothes as it was for the little girls to wear their white dresses. People's ideas of fun differ. Mr. Thorne walked about the square, speaking to all the grown people and calling the boys and girls by name. The motormen seemed to feel picnicky too, and joked and laughed with the boys crowded into the front seats. Presently they rang their gongs furiously to warn anyone who was late, and then the long bars on either side of the car were put down so that it wouldn't be easy for children to fall out. Mr. Thorne ran into the middle of the square and looked up each of the 6 streets leading into it. Then he gave the signal. The bells clanged, the cars started, and the children began to laugh and cheer. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 4. World's End Pond. World's End Pond was the place appointed for the picnic, and Dora was anxious to see what it was like. Naturally, the end of the world must be a most interesting spot. The first part of the way was only the road to the big city 6 miles distant, and this was not new to any of the Westmore children. But when they had jolted and clanged their way through its crowded streets and through a long stretch of dusty tenement houses, they came to a river bedside, which lay the car track. Back in the city, people had not noticed the picnic cars. If they saw them at all, they only glanced at the signs "Special," and then looked away, impatient because it was not the car for which they were waiting. But when the picnic reached the river, it reached a place where a big car packed with children, singing and waving flags, was very exciting. A man rinsing milk cans waved his hat, and a woman hanging up dish towels paused to flap one vigorously. The young people in a passing automobile laughed and shouted, "Good luck!" And even the dogs ran out to bark in a friendly and excited way as though they knew these were no ordinary electric cars. Overhead, the sky was as blue as June alone can make it, and the fields were starred with daisies. Over the grass, the wind swept and waved as though the feet of fairies passed. And this went on for a long distance. Then the way grew even more mysterious. Leaving the real street, the cars ran on a road of their own, right through a wood. On either side, tall trees grew out of ground brown with pine needles. Only at the left one began to catch glimpses of something silvery, just a glimmer, between tree trunks. The boys shouted, but Dora sat quite still, for was it not the end of the world to which she was coming? Presently, the bits of silver grew bigger and wider. The trees moved farther apart, and a sandy beach appeared. The cars stopped. The children did not wait to have the bars pushed up. They dived under them. Miss Page told her class to put their boxes and wraps together on one of the long tables which stood in the grove. Then they might do as they liked. At 12, everybody was to have lunch. Lucy ran down to the water's edge, but Dora stopped under the trees, just where the beach began. Where was it, this end of the world? Before her lay a lovely little round pond, all bright and shining under the sun. Beyond it rose softly rounded hills, into which the little lake exactly fitted, just as though somebody had measured the space it was to occupy and fastened it in like a diamond into its setting. But where was the end? Across, on one of the hills, a road went up to the sky. Dora could see the trees on either side, right where it reached the very top of the hill, and it certainly looked as though it didn't stop there at all, but went on and on, as roads have a way of doing. Dora stood looking so hard at the pond and the hills that she did not see the other girls down on the beach. "Well, Dora," said Mr. Thorne's voice, "what do you think of the World's End Pond?" "I don't see the end," said Dora, before she had time to be surprised that Mr. Thorne was so near. "I want to know what lies beyond." Mr. Thorne smiled, but it was such a kind smile that Dora didn't feel he was laughing at her. It wasn't that sort of a smile at all, rather one as though Mr. Thorne was also wondering. "Dora, did you ever learn at school that the earth is round?" Dora said she did. Mr. Thorne took a plain gold ring from his hand. "Let's see," he said. "A circle being round really doesn't begin nor end anywhere, does it? We can't find a place on this ring where it begins, can we? But we can take any spot on it and just say it begins there, and then, you see, it will have to end in the very same place. And so with World's End Pond. If the world ends here, little Dora, just so truly, it is the beginning of the world as well." Dora smiled. She hadn't known Mr. Thorne could understand like that. "And so it goes on and on," she said, looking across the lake. "Exactly," said Mr. Thorne, the smile again in his eyes. "There is no place where we can find what is beyond the end of the earth, because just there is where the earth begins." Mr. Thorne looked as though he was thinking hard, but just then Lucy discovered that Dora was not with the girls and came running to fetch her. "Miss Page is going to walk around the point with us," she called. "The boats are over there." Just around a little point, through the woods, across from where the cars stopped, stood a wooden building, where candy and lemonade were for sale, and boats to let. The older boys pounced upon the rowboats immediately, but at the dock was one quite large motor launch. The man who owned it was willing to take people around the lake. Lucy and Dora looked at each other. This seemed a desirable use for some of that gift money. "We must ask Miss Page," said Lucy. "Let us go too, Grace," said Alice Harper. "It will be such fun to sail around the lake." Miss Page was talking to the boatman, and presently she invited all her class to go on the launch. When it came Dora's turn to be helped onto the boat, the man picked her up and swung her over onto the stern. "There you are," he said. "You weigh just about as much as my little girl." When the launch started, Dora found herself next to the man who held the steering wheel. Before the prow, the water divided into two even waves, and behind the boat lay a broad strip which looked all soapy because of the many bubbles the propeller stirred up. There were no houses on that side of the World's End pond, only trees coming down to the water's edge and big gray rocks. Some of the rocks were partly covered, and the boat, which was named the Swift, could not get very close to land for fear of running on a stone. Across the pond, some pretty green farm fields broke the woods and came down to the shore. The launch passed one point where 5 red cows stood knee-deep in the water. Off this beach grew weeds, which the boatman told Dora was called rushes. Above them darted dragonflies with gauzy wings that moved so fast they were only a blur. One lighted on the Swift, and Dora saw the bright blue spots on its back. "My little girl calls them darning needles," said the man. Dora laughed at this funny name. She must remember to tell Uncle Dan. Miss Page sat between Iris and Mary. Dora thought she looked very lovely, all in white except for a bright rose sweater. Dora decided that when she was a young lady, she would have one just like it. By and by, the Swift came back to the pier and took another party. The boats were as popular as ever, and some of the young men had thought to bring bathing suits. They were having a fine time, swimming and diving. There was so much to see and to watch that Dora quite forgot she had been feeling hungry. But she was glad when Mr. Thorne pulled a rope near the boathouse and a bell in a tree began to ring. That was the signal for lunch. Some of the people preferred to eat at long tables in the grove, but Miss Page and her girls sat in a group under one of the big trees. One can always sit on a chair at home, and it is best to seize a chance to use a rock or a pine needle cushion. "Where is Iris?" asked Miss Page. The chattering girls stopped opening their lunch boxes. Iris had been with them only a moment ago. "We can't eat without her," said Miss Page, jumping up. "Where has she gone?" Lucy, Grace, and Alice also left their lunches to search for Iris among the many people in the grove. Presently, Miss Page came back, looking quite troubled. "I can't find her," she said. "Didn't any of you see which way she went?" "Iris is over by the boats," said Lucy, running up. "She didn't bring any lunch." "Why, I have more than I can eat," exclaimed Miss Page. "Mother packed me an enormous luncheon." "So have I. So have I," cried every one of the girls. "Show me where she is, Lucy," said Miss Page. While they were gone, Alice took a paper napkin and laid on it a chicken sandwich. Grace put a jelly one beside it, and everyone added something. Dora contributed 2 cookies and a little cake for her share and Lucy's. Miss Page came back holding Iris by one hand while Lucy held the other. Though Iris was smiling, she looked rather tearful. "Benny had the earache yesterday, and Mrs. Whitman was up all night with him," said Miss Page. "She and Iris forgot about packing a lunch. It is lucky for me, for I hate to take food home from a picnic." Iris did not speak as she sat down, but Grace patted her hand, and Mildred her shoulder, and little Dora, who was the youngest in the class, smiled anxiously at her. There was plenty of luncheon for Iris. Presently one of the big boys came around with a basket perfectly filled with ice cream cones, vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. Everybody might have 2. Somebody must have been very busy filling those cones, for all the young men in Mr. Thorne's class were going about with baskets. After lunch, people lay around on the pine needles, and Mr. Hooper, the Sunday school superintendent, told a funny story. It was really very funny, and the children enjoyed it as much as the grown-ups. Then Mrs. Proctor's class of boys gave a dramatic reading of Puss in Boots. Poor Puss in enormous rubber boots on a June day. looked uncomfortable, and deserved applause. After the reading, Mr. Hooper called some of the choir boys together, and with them to lead, people sang all sorts of songs until the sun grew less warm and they could play games again. The boys played baseball, and the girls ran potato races and obstacle races, and the older people worked hard helping the fun along. Lucy enjoyed the races, but Dora, who was not as strong, was soon contented just to sit on the bank and look at the World's End pond. She wanted to look hard, so when she was at home again, she would only have to think, and there it would lie before her. Dora was only 8, but she had discovered a rather wonderful secret, that every lovely thing in life is always ours if we have ever seen it, or it has ever happened to us. Then it is ours, any time we want it, just for the thinking. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 5. Stars and Things. When the picnic cars reached Westmore that evening, Mr. Merrill was in the square to meet them. Quite a few fathers had come downtown because the party was later than expected, and the mothers were beginning to wonder what had happened. Lucy and Dora were glad to see their father. They said goodbye to Miss Page and the other girls, and then each took one of his hands and skipped along beside him. Even after an all-day picnic, they were not too tired to skip. When they reached the Brown Cottage, Mrs. Merrill and Uncle Dan were sitting out in the backyard enjoying the long June twilight. "Well, did you have a nice time?" asked their mother. "And why are you so late? I thought the cars were to start back at 5:30. "People didn't come," explained Lucy, putting down her hat and sweater and settling herself on her father's knee. Dora had already climbed into Uncle Dan's lap. She and Uncle Dan were great friends. "Then," said Lucy, "after everybody was supposed to be on the car and we had started, Mrs. Carroll found that 2 of her boys weren't there, so we had to stop and call. They answered, and after a while they came through the woods. Mr. Thorne said everybody must stay on the cars till we were counted. Some of the teachers didn't go, so there were some children who didn't have anybody to see that they came back. I wish you had gone, Mother." "I couldn't," said Mrs. Merrill. "My kitchen stove was so gummed up that I didn't have grace enough to use it any longer without a thorough cleaning." "I wish Uncle Dan had come," said Dora. "Uncle Dan had other fish to fry," said their young uncle. "Fish?" repeated Lucy, who always thought Uncle Dan meant exactly what he said. "Sure," said Uncle Dan. "That's why your mother had to clean the stove." Mrs. Merrill sniffed. "Dan," she said, "I wish you'd content yourself with talking so the children could understand you." "You understand, don't you, Dora?" asked Uncle Dan. Dora smiled sleepily. Uncle Dan never puzzled her as he did Lucy. She understood him very well. "There were cows walking in the water," she confided, "and over the rushes a lot of sewing machines were flying around." "Sewing machines!" exclaimed Mrs. Merrill. "What is the child talking about?" "That's right," said Uncle Dan. "I've often seen the air black with them." "For goodness sake, Dan," said his sister, "you're the worst boy I ever saw." "Molly, you brought me up," said Uncle Dan, tickling Dora to make her squeal. "It's a lot to be responsible for," said Mrs. Merrill. "What do you and Dora mean with your sewing machines?" "Just big flies with lace wings," explained Lucy. "I guess it was darning needles," said Dora. "The man called them something funny." "Oh," said Mrs. Merrill, and then she laughed. "Sewing machines is good enough for us, isn't it, Dora?" asked Uncle Dan. "Like the thunderbugs over there in the grass." Dora smiled. This was a favorite joke of her uncle's. Once, when she was a very little girl, he had told her that the fireflies were lightning bugs, and she mistook the name. "What did you spend your money for?" asked Mrs. Merrill. "Candy?" "Yes," said Lucy. "I bought candy, but I gave part to Dora and the others. Dora gave all her money to the 3 little Baker boys. Their teacher wasn't with them, and they wanted so much to go on the motorboat around the lake. Dora thought she'd like them to know how nice it was." "I knew Dora would find a use for that quarter," said Mr. Merrill. Uncle Dan patted her head. "Mrs. Carroll had a lady with her," said Lucy. "Not a lady who lives in Westmore, but somebody from far away. She kept looking at Dora and looking at her, and then she asked what her name was. And after that she asked what Mother's name was before she was married. I said it was Mary Syme." Mrs. Merrill gave a little exclamation. "What did the lady say then?" she asked quite sharply. "Nothing," said Lucy, "only that Dora reminded her of somebody." "Molly," said Mr. Merrill, "it's time these children went to bed. They've had a hard day." "Yes, they must go," said their mother. "Dan, you put Dora down. Half her teasing to stay is because you keep her." Uncle Dan always pretended to be terribly afraid of his sister. He set Dora on her feet at once. "Hustle," he said. "She'll have my scalp if you aren't in bed in 5 minutes." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Merrill. "They must both have a bath. Lucy, you are quicker than Dora. Get undressed and see if we can be down by the time I fill the tub. Does either of you want any supper?" Lucy said she didn't. "I'm not hungry," said Dora, "but I think there's a grasshopper down my back. I sort of feel it hopping." "I hope not," said her mother. "Grasshopper stains are dreadful to get out of white clothes." Mrs. Merrill followed Lucy into the house, but Dora, forgetting the grasshopper, lingered a moment, leaning against her uncle's shoulder and looking up at the stars. She loved Uncle Dan dearly. He had been only 17 when Lucy's chariot of fire brought Dora to them 4 years ago. Of course, he was quite grown up now, but Mrs. Merrill treated him as though he was still the motherless little brother she had taken care of since he was a baby. Uncle Dan pretended he did not like this, but Dora knew he did. She looked up at the soft sky where specks of gold were beginning to show. The sky was still blue, and tonight the stars looked blue also. "Did you know the stars have names, Uncle Dan?" she asked. "Miss Page told me so. What is the name of this big one overhead?" Uncle Dan looked up. "Couldn't say," he replied. "But I'll find out, Dora. I'll find out even if I have to ask a policeman." Dora laughed and hugged him for good night. She knew a way better than that. In the children's corner at the Westmore Public Library was a book about the stars. That would be easier than asking a fat policeman who was supposed to be on duty merely during the day. It was not probable he would want to be bothered about things that showed only at night. When Dora went, Uncle Dan and Father Merrill were left alone in the coolness of the backyard. "I wonder," said Mr. Merrill, "who that lady was." "I should let that alone," replied Dan. "Only," said Mr. Merrill, thinking aloud, "it wouldn't be right to let slip anything that might be to Dora's advantage." Dan grunted. "Dora comes of nice people," said Mr. Merrill slowly. "She has pretty notions and ideas and a kind of bright way of looking at things. She's quick at her books, too. I can't see that she needs any more than she's likely to have," growled Dan. "If her people have money, they could do more for her than I ever can. They couldn't love her any more than you and Molly have done all these years, and that's what counts to a little child," said Dan shortly. "The trouble is that she isn't going to stay a child. Of course, she's like my own, and anything I do for one shall be done for both, but there's another side to it. What about the people she really belongs to? From their point of view, it isn't right to lose any chance of finding them." "Oh, you do as you like," said Dan, getting up and turning toward the gate. "Dora's happy here. She may not be if you rake up her relations, if she's got any." The gate shut behind Dan, and Mr. Merrill sat in the dark until he heard his wife come downstairs. Then he went into the house. Mrs. Merrill was in her bedroom looking into a box she had taken from the closet. When her husband saw what she was doing, he knew that she was troubled, for the box contained the clothes Dora wore when she came to them that day in the big automobile. But as Mr. Merrill came in, his wife put everything back again. "Dora is ours," she said, just as though Mr. Merrill said she wasn't, and this was unfair, for he had not spoken one word. "We adopted her by law, and no law can take her away." "No law of man," agreed Mr. Merrill, "but it might not be right to keep her if her folks did turn up and could do more for her than we can. I can teach her to cook and sew and keep house and tell the truth and behave like a self-respecting girl," said Mrs. Merrill. "You can give her good food and an education through the high school. Lucy loves her like a sister, and I don't blame Lucy one mite for what she said about my name. The child never thinks of Dora not being her sister. Dora will have all the chance to grow up in a clean, decent home that any child needs, and you better let well enough alone." "So Dan said," observed Mr. Merrill. "Dan," said Molly Merrill, "is daffy over Dora. He thinks the sun rises and sets for that child. His judgment concerning her isn't worth a pin. If Dora isn't completely spoiled, it won't be Dan's fault." "No, it won't," agreed Mr. Merrill. "But you think it over, Molly. It couldn't do any harm to find out what this lady who was with Mrs. Carroll meant." "She didn't mean anything," declared his wife, "any more than any child may remind you of somebody you know. We never made any secret of Dora's coming, and we tried hard enough then to find her a family. Mrs. Carroll knows that. We might as well go to bed. I expect before morning one or both of the children will be sick. There's no accounting for the stuff they eat on a picnic." "Well," said Mr. Merrill, taking off his coat, "I've known people to eat considerable trash and still live." "Put the cat out," said Mrs. Merrill, "and leave the door unlocked for Dan. I shan't sleep till I know he's in, and I'll lock it when he comes." End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Doolan. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. What Lucy Found. The day after the picnic was Saturday. Dora and Lucy wished it was Sunday, for then it would seem like another holiday right after a specially nice time. Saturday was always a busy day for Mrs. Merrill, and she expected the little girls to help her. Perhaps one reason why Lucy and Dora loved the Brown Cottage as much as they did was because they had a share in making it a home, just as they liked the garden because they planted the seeds and helped the flowers grow. When Uncle Dan went downstairs in the morning, Lucy and Dora usually got up, but on the day after the picnic, Mrs. Merrill told her brother not to wake them. When Dora finally opened her eyes, it was much later than usual. Lucy was still asleep, so Dora yawned, turned over, and settled down for another nap. But just then came a terrific noise somewhere in the house. It was not an ordinary sort of noise at all, but a crash, followed by a series of hard thumps, which ended in a splintery, splitting noise. Lucy woke, which was not surprising, and she and Dora both jumped out of bed. They had never heard anything like this before, and it was not a sound they cared to hear again. "What is it?" asked Dora. Lucy was hardly awake, but Dora's voice sounded frightened, so she pretended to be very brave. She opened the door at the head of the stairs. Everything was very quiet, but something must have caused that terrible crash. The two little girls went straight down to the kitchen. There, the tea kettle was singing, and the breakfast table showed that Uncle Dan and Father had eaten and gone. In the pantry was a bowl of cake batter, and an egg beater lay beside a dish of half-beaten eggs. But where was Mother? Dora's lip began to tremble. The usually cheery kitchen seemed strange and lonesome. "Lucy, what made that noise?" she asked. "Where's Mother?" "Perhaps she's gone to the market," said Lucy, though she felt sure Mrs. Merrill would not leave a half-finished cake. Just then came another sound, this time from the cellar. Its door was open from the little entry where the refrigerator stood, and the children peeped fearfully down the steep, dark stairs. There in the gloom something was moving. "Mother!" cried Lucy. "Oh, Mother, did you fall down the stairs?" "No, I didn't," came Mrs. Merrill's voice, and the next second she stood looking up at the two little night-gowned figures, hand in hand at the top of the stairs. Tears shone in Dora's eyes. "Child alive," said Mother, "did you think I made all that racket? No wonder you were scared. I was myself." "What was it?" Lucy asked again. "Just the ice. The man didn't latch the refrigerator door, and a 50-pound cake jumped out and bumped the whole length of the cellar stairs. I thought the house was coming down." "So did we," said Dora. "Lucy, hand me the dishpan to put the pieces in," went on her mother, "and then both of you get dressed. I thought I'd let you sleep as late as you like this morning, but it's Saturday, and there's work to do." Lucy and Dora were busy all the morning. After their breakfast, they washed and wiped the dishes, and there really were a good many, because Mother made bread and pies as well as cake. Mrs. Merrill swept the parlour rugs, and then they mopped the floor and dusted everything carefully. Next they made the beds, which had clean sheets, as is the custom with self-respecting beds on a Saturday morning. It is some work to make beds with clean sheets, and no wonder that Dora was dismayed to discover, just as they finished Uncle Dan's, that they had put on no upper sheet at all. There it lay on a chair, a reproachful white drapery. "Oh dear," sighed Dora. "I suppose we'll have to break this bed open again." Of course Uncle Dan would not like a bed with only one sheet, but Lucy thought Dora should have remembered it. It was on her side of the bed. Dora thought Lucy forgot it just as much as she did, and said so. When they went down to make the bed in their mother's room, both felt rather cross and were critical of wrinkles and corners, not their own, but each other's. Because of this, Mrs. Merrill's bed, when it was finished, looked smoother and trimmer than either of the others. Lucy hung up her mother's kimono in the closet. Just as she was closing the door, she saw something shiny on the floor. Picking it up, she turned to Dora in astonishment, for it was the most wonderful and interesting thing she had ever seen. Both forgot they had been feeling cross. What Lucy found was a tiny silver ring like a very small key ring. Attached to it were 6 little silver charms. Lucy laid the ring on the bed while she and Dora looked at the little figures. None of them was over an inch long. Some were smaller. The first was an oddly shaped silver shoe, which Lucy and Dora knew at once for a sabot, such as the Dutch children wear. They had read about sabots in the Dutch Twins. Next came a pretty spotted fish, enamelled in colours, salmon pink, with little shining dots and white underneath. Its fins and tail were flecked with gold. The third charm was a tiny soldier in a bright scarlet uniform. At his side he carried a sword which would move back and forth. Next to the soldier was a charm Lucy thought prettiest of all, a plump little pink coral heart about as big as the rubber on the end of a pencil. Next to this was a slender little figure which appeared to be a baby, but only its arms were free, and it was rolled round and round in a curious sort of wrapping. The last charm pleased Dora best, a wee silver bear about 3/4 of an inch long, with a shaggy coat and green eyes. Even the toes on its feet were indicated. "Where did they come from?" said Lucy. "Why hasn't Mother shown them to us?" "Let's ask her," said Dora, and both ran into the kitchen. Mrs. Merrill had just put the pantry in order and was starting dinner. She stopped short when the children ran in. "Lucy, where did you get that?" she demanded. "On your closet floor, just inside the door," said Lucy. Mother's voice sounded as though she was not pleased. "I must have dropped them," said Mrs. Merrill after a pause. "I can't tell you about them now, children. Not this morning, anyway." "Oh, tell us where they came from," begged Dora. "The little silver shoe must have come from where the Dutch children live. Probably they all came from across the ocean. Lucy, you put them in my top bureau drawer. Neither you nor Dora must touch them again. I'll think the matter over, and perhaps some day I will tell you all I know about them." The children took a last look at the charms. "How I do love the little heart," sighed Lucy. "The bear is the dearest," said Dora. "How pretty it would be on my silver chain Uncle Dan gave me. I lost the ivory elephant that came with it. Perhaps if we are very, very good, Mother will let me wear the bear and you the heart." In the kitchen, Mrs. Merrill heard them talking. "I wonder if I might," she thought to herself. But when the girls came back, she only told them to set the table for dinner. That afternoon, Lucy and Dora went to the public library, as they did every Saturday, and often on other days as well. They had each to choose a book for themselves, and to bring 2 for Father and Mother to read on Sunday. Uncle Dan liked to choose his own books. The public library had a corner just for the children, with nice low shelves which they could easily reach, all filled with delightful and interesting books. Lucy went at once to the place where the fairy tales were kept, but Dora looked until she found the book that told about the stars. When she opened it, it seemed rather hard reading, but she decided to take it, because she felt sure Uncle Dan would help her with the long words. And anyway, it was most important that they should find the name of that special bright star she saw every fair night. It was not probable that Uncle Dan would remember to ask the policeman. While the children were in the library, Alice Harper came to return her book. When she saw Lucy and Dora, she came to speak to them softly. Almost always they remembered to talk only in whispers in the library. If they forgot, Miss Perkins, the librarian, would smile at them and then glance at the people who were reading and wanted to be quiet. They talked about the picnic and what a nice time they had, and about the Sunday school lesson for the next day. It was to be the last meeting for the summer, and Miss Page had asked them all to be sure to come. Lucy and Dora were sorry when the Sunday school closed, because they loved Miss Page and missed seeing her. But Miss Page always went away during the summer, and so did Alice and Grace. Alice was going next week to the seashore, and she was feeling quite excited about it. Alice wore a white dress, and about her neck was a slender silver chain with a tiny medallion hanging from it. Dora saw it at once. She did so long to have the silver bear to put on her chain. "Uncle Jack brought it to me," said Alice, seeing that Dora noticed it. "It came from France. That is a picture of Joan of Arc." Lucy and Dora thought it was beautiful. They had their books charged and took those the librarian had chosen for Mr. and Mrs. Merrill, and as they went home, they talked about Alice's picture medal and the wonderful things they had found in the morning in their mother's room. "I wish," said Lucy, "that Mother would think it over very quickly and decide to lend us one of those charms." "Oh, so do I," said Dora, "only she never does do the things as soon as we want." End of Chapter 6. Recording by Robert Doolan. Board Game Basics Podcast. Chapter 7 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Doolan. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. What the Poster Said. On Wednesday night, when Mr. Merrill came home from the printing office, he found the children feeling quite sad. Timothy, the tiger-striped pussy, had been visiting Mrs. Ely and returned with a bleeding ear. Mrs. Ely was not a person, as one might suppose from her name, but a pretty little Maltese kitten belonging to the people next door. Timothy liked Mrs. Ely very much better than she liked him. "I wish Timmy would stay at home," said Dora, showing her father the injured ear. "Or else visit a kind cat," Lucy remarked dolefully. Just then Uncle Dan came. All day long he had been nailing shingles on Mr. Elliott's new barn, and he was tired and hot. "Timothy hasn't much sense," he said as he went into the house. "If I called on a lady and she scratched me in the face, I'd know enough to go home." Lucy looked more sober than ever. She did not notice the slow smile creeping over her father's face as the kitchen door shut behind Dan. Dora laughed. After Uncle Dan had washed, changed his clothes, and eaten his supper, he would probably go to call on Olive Gates. How funny to think of Olive scratching his face. "Well," said Mr. Merrill, who couldn't bear to see Lucy troubled, "I guess Timmy isn't much hurt. And I've something nice to tell you two. You let me get cleaned up, and then we'll see." The night was so hot that Mrs. Merrill had planned a cold supper, sliced meat and a potato salad, with bread and butter and iced tea for the grown people. Dora and Lucy had their usual glasses of milk. On the side table stood saucers of strawberries and a plate of cookies. The little girls had hulled the berries, and there was to be a surprise about them. Father and Uncle Dan used a great deal of water, both hot and cold, but when they were ready for supper, both looked rested. Father had put on slippers and a thin coat, but Uncle Dan was quite dressed up in white trousers and white shoes. Without doubt, he was going to see Olive. When they had eaten the first part of supper, Lucy started to take away the plates and bring the strawberries. Now it was time for the surprise. Dora, Lucy, and their mother exchanged a smile, and Dora slipped from her seat as though she was going to help Lucy with the plates. But she didn't. Instead, she slid softly out by the screen door and ran around the house. When Lucy had taken away the dishes and brushed up the crumbs, she put the berries and cookies on the table. Uncle Dan lifted his spoon. "Oh, wait!" Lucy exclaimed, catching his arm and giggling outright. "Wait for Dora." "Why, where is Dora?" asked Mr. Merrill, noticing her absence for the first time. "She went on an errand," said Mother Merrill. "Here, Dan, take a cookie, but wait a minute for your berries." Just then, Dora came flying back, carrying carefully a bowl of vanilla ice cream. There are advantages in living opposite a drugstore. This was the surprise, you see. "When will you tell us about the something nice?" Lucy asked when the last berry was eaten. "You little girls help your mother what she wants, and then come out here in the yard and I'll tell you," said Mr. Merrill. It did not take long to do the dishes. Mrs. Merrill helped, and the gas stove heated the water so quickly. A gas stove is a great convenience. Lucy and Dora could remember summers before they had one, and how much hotter the kitchen used to be. When the work was all done, they hurried out to their father. "Now tell us," they demanded. "Mother, you come too," said Mr. Merrill. "We'll want you to pass judgment on this plan." Mrs. Merrill came, pulling the kitchen rocker after her. It was pleasant in the yard now that the sun was low and the shadows were beginning to grow long. "This morning," began Mr. Merrill, "a job of printing came in. Just some posters, but they seemed to me rather interesting. Bud Evans did the job, but I told him when he got it set up to pull me a proof, and I brought the proof home to show you children." "A circus," said Lucy delightfully as her father drew from his pocket a folded blue piece of paper. "Will you take us?" Mr. Merrill smiled as he tossed her the poster. Lucy and Dora spread it out with impatient fingers. Westmore Village Improvement Society headed the poster in big letters, and directly underneath, in still larger type, were the words, "Vacation School." "A school in summer?" said Lucy, not very well pleased. Dora had read a little further. "Games instruction in sewing and making baskets, folk dancing. Dora lifted a flushed, eager face. "Let's see," said Mrs. Merrill, reaching for the poster. "It's the Village Improvement Society," said her husband. "They've hired some teachers, and 5 mornings a week, from 8:30 to 11, there's to be an outdoor school for the children. The girls are to meet in the grove around the Lincoln School, and when it rains, they can go inside. The boys are to use the Emerson school grounds across town. It looks to me like a plan where the children could have a nice, safe time and considerable fun." 50 cents a week, said Mrs. Merrill, considering the poster. "That's $1 for 2. "For how long?" Dan asked. He was looking down at Dora's wistful face as she sprawled on the grass beside him. 6 weeks, said his sister. "You get considerable for your money," said Mr. Merrill tentatively. "Of course, I'd like them to go, John, but with everything costing so much—" Mrs. Merrill stopped. "Mother, couldn't we?" begged Lucy. "I'll pay for one of them," said Uncle Dan. "Looks like too good a proposition to turn down." "Dan," said his sister affectionately. "That's like you, Dan, but if they go, I guess we can manage it." For answer, Dan drew $50 from his pocket and dropped it down Dora's neck. "Fork out, John," he said to his brother-in-law. Laughing to himself, Mr. Merrill tossed Lucy another silver coin and was rewarded with hugs and squeals. Dora couldn't reach her $50, since it was way down her spine, but she twisted over and shut a butterfly kiss into the palm of Uncle Dan's hand, hanging down beside his chair. Nobody saw her do it, and nobody knew it but Dan. Then she got up, shook the $50 the rest of the way, and hugged him hard, so the others would see that she was properly grateful. But she did not say much, only looked happy, and when Dora was especially happy, her eyes shone like blue stars. "Guess I'll be going," said Uncle Dan, looking at his watch. "Choir rehearsal tonight." "Choir rehearsal," laughed Lucy. "Sure thing," said Uncle Dan, closing the gate. "Don't sit up for me, Molly." "He's going to see Olive," said Lucy. "Hush now," said Mr. Merrill. "Perhaps he is, Lucy, but it's choir night too, and you mustn't tease your Uncle Dan." "I didn't mean to tease him," said Lucy. "Only he wouldn't put on his white trousers just to go to rehearsal." Dora said nothing. She knew more about Uncle Dan and Olive than anyone else. The past Easter, Uncle Dan, in doubt as to whether Olive would prefer daffodils or violets, had consulted Dora, and following her advice, chose the violets. Before long, Mr. Merrill went down the street to see how the beans were looking in Mr. Sharp's garden. Everybody who had planted beans was feeling worried about them, for a queer kind of spot was coming on their leaves. It was a new spot, and nobody knew just what to do about it. Bedtime was drawing near, but both little girls were anxious not to remind Mother of this fact. It could not be anything but hot in that upstairs west room. "Mother," said Lucy after a long pause, "have you thought yet?" "About what, child?" asked Mrs. Merrill. "Dear me, I ought to be sewing, and yet it's so hot I can't feel like lifting a needle. What was I to think about?" "The little silver things we found in your closet last Saturday?" "Oh," said her mother. "Well, yes, but there's not much to say. They were in the pocket of Dora's coat when she came to us, that's all." Lucy sat upright. "Then they are Dora's?" she exclaimed. "Yes, I suppose so," assented her mother. "I hoped somebody might know something about them, but nobody ever did." "Then why can't Dora have them?" asked Lucy. Dora herself had not said one word, but her eyes were big and bright with excitement. "Sometime," said Mrs. Merrill. "They ought not to be lost. When she is big enough, she may have them, but only to keep." "Oh, mayn't I have just the bear?" begged Dora. "To live with me, Mother? To put on my silver chain like Alice's little medal? And couldn't Lucy have the pink heart?" Mrs. Merrill did not answer at once. After all, she thought, why shouldn't the child enjoy the little bear? It really belongs to her. If I let you take it, she said at last, will you be contented not to wear it every day, but only with your good dresses and when I say you may? Dora had her arms about her neck, making all kinds of promises. And no teasing about it either, ended Mrs. Merrill. No teasing, agreed Dora, and the little pink heart for Lucy. Lucy may wear my coral string, said her mother. Lucy, you'll like that, won't you? Run and bring out the little ring, Dora. While Dora was gone, Mrs. Merrill spoke quickly to Lucy. I'd like you to wear the heart, and so would Dora, bless her. But you see, don't you, that ring with its little charms is about the only thing there is belonging to Dora before she came to us, and I wouldn't want anybody to say I let my own child take it. It might be lost, Lucy. If Dora loses the bear, well, she's done it herself, and I can't be blamed for it. But if you were to wear the heart and you lost it, that would be something we couldn't set right again. So you'll like my coral beads I had when I was a little girl, won't you? Lucy liked the beads very much indeed. She was entirely satisfied to wear them and thought them just as pretty as the pink heart. When Dora brought the ring, Mrs. Merrill carefully took off the tiny green-eyed bear and slid it on Dora's silver chain. I'll put the rest under lock and key, she said. Now when Dora wears the bear, Lucy may have the string of coral. But remember, only when you are dressed up and going somewhere, and no teasing, or back they both go. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Robert Doolan. Board Game Basics Podcast. Chapter 8 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Doolan. Board Game Basics Podcast. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 8. Sunday Morning. The vacation classes were not to begin for a week, but one afternoon Lucy and Dora went around by the Lincoln School to see whether anything interesting had happened. They knew the place well, for it was their schoolhouse. The pleasant big building was different from a school in a city because it stood in such large grounds. There was no fence, only a green lawn with a number of elms and maples. Sometimes, when the weather in June grew very warm, the teachers would take the children outside. Each class would gather under a tree and read and spell and have geography lessons sitting together in the pleasant out of doors. This was a nice way to go to school. The children found most interesting preparations going on. Near the building, under the largest tree, stood 2 long tables with benches on either side. There was always a pole with a net for a basketball, which the big girls played. But now there were 2 swings in different trees, and a slide and a sandpit. To wait until next Monday was hard, but it was nice to have something to look forward to, and to wonder how many of their friends were going to the vacation school. When Sunday morning came, the children woke with a realization that they would have only once more to go to bed before the proper day arrived. Now that there was no Sunday school, Mrs. Merrill told the little girls she wanted them to go to church. You may wear your necklaces, she said. Dora kept the bear in a tiny pink pasteboard box in her small drawer. The bureau in the children's room was an old-fashioned one with a drawer on either side of the looking glass. The right-hand one belonged to Lucy and the left-hand one to Dora. The 2 top big drawers were Lucy's and the 2 bottom ones were Dora's. The string of coral stayed in a wee wooden box with a picture pasted on the top, which Lucy thought very beautiful. It was of a boy flying a kite, and Uncle Dan said his name was Ben Franklin. Lucy supposed this was a joke until in a library book she read about a man of that name who experimented with electricity by flying a kite. Then she was suspicious of Uncle Dan. When the children were dressed for church, they put on their necklaces and went downstairs. Father and Mother were ready, and they started early, so as not to have to hurry, for June was certainly proving rather hot. Lucy and Dora walked together in front. The way to church was pleasant, along a tree-shaded street and past the lovely flower gardens. Every September, in the Westmore Town Hall, there was a flower show, when people picked the prettiest blossoms from their gardens and brought them where everybody could enjoy them and decide what kind of flowers they would try to raise next year. When the family reached the church, the bell was ringing and people were going in or stopping to talk on the steps. Mrs. Merrill spoke to Mrs. Escott, but Lucy and Dora went demurely in. Just inside the door, they saw Mr. Beckwith. Dora knew that he was standing there so that, if any strangers came, he could welcome them and show them to a seat. She wished he would say, "Good morning, Miss Merrill. May I show you and your sister to a seat? How far front would you like to go?" But Mr. Beckwith only smiled at the little girls. He knew that Lucy and Dora could find their usual seat. The church seemed very quiet, with pretty shaded lights falling through the stained glass windows. Some were partly open, and the woodbine outside waved slender tentacles across the frames, as though it wanted to see what was going on inside. Roses in vases made the air sweet. Ladies in light summer dresses and children in white were sitting here and there in the pews. After the bright sunshine in the street, the shady places in the high raftered roof seemed pleasant. Mr. and Mrs. Merrill came and sat down beside the children, and Mr. Merrill found the first hymn and gave the book to his wife. Lucy and Dora found it for themselves, and then they sat quietly while the organist played. Presently the music changed into a hymn, and then in the distance sounded voices. This was the moment Dora liked best of any. She loved to hear the music grow nearer and nearer, and to see the choir come in, with the little boys in front, many of whom she knew. But Eddie, George, Francis, and the others, scrubbed and brushed, with very smooth hair and clean white cotters, walking slowly as they sang, looked quite different from the rough and tumbled little boys she saw outside of church. Uncle Dan was almost always one of the last to come in. Today he was last of all, walking just before Mr. Thorne. Dora thought he looked very nice, and watched to see if he would glance at her. But Uncle Dan did not lift his eyes from his music. He went slowly up the chancel steps and turned to the right. Robert Armstrong, walking with him, turned to the left. When they took their seats, they were on opposite sides, facing each other. But Dora knew that with the last hymn they would walk out again together. This morning Uncle Dan was sitting where Dora could see him plainly, and after the hymn was finished and Mr. Thorne began to read some scripture verses, he did look down at his sister and the children. When he caught Dora's glance, his eyes smiled at her, though his face remained grave. Dora liked the music and the service. She could find the places in the prayer book quite well, better than Lucy could do, but she never cared for the sermon. Mr. Thorne talked about things that were interesting only to grown people. At least, Dora supposed that older people found them interesting. Uncle Dan seemed to like what he was saying, for he looked steadily at Mr. Thorne as though listening. At first, Lucy tried to listen to the sermon, but Mr. Thorne used such long words that she could not decide what he was talking about. So she looked about the church and saw that Olive Gates was wearing a pretty new hat with a wreath of roses that made her look like a rose herself. Then she looked at the flowers on the altar and the coloured lights falling through the stained glass windows on either side of the church, and saw, sitting in Mrs. Carroll's pew, the lady who had been at the picnic and who had asked her mother's name. Lucy also read 2 hymns. Dora did not listen at all. First she looked at Mrs. Butler, who sat in the pew in front. The Sunday was so hot that hardly anybody wore gloves, and Dora admired the pretty rings with the blue and white stones on Mrs. Butler's fingers. She wished that Mother had rings like them. Then she looked at Mother's hands, clasped in her lap. They were not as white as Mrs. Butler's, and the nails were not rosy and shiny, and she wore only one ring, a plain gold one. But the next moment Dora thought of the many things Mother's hands found to do for them. Cooking and sweeping and sewing and washing. There was hardly a moment when they were idle, and they were so busy that one never stopped to see how they looked. They found time to do pleasant things too, making a dress for Dora's doll, teaching Lucy to knit, giving baths to the little girls, and rubbing Uncle Dan's sprained shoulder. No wonder they were not white and soft like Mrs. Butler's hands. Next, Dora thought of her dear bear, and tucked in her chin and twisted the chain so she could see its bright eyes. She thought they compared very favourably with Mrs. Butler's blue stones. Mr. Thorne was still preaching, so Dora looked at the stained-glass windows. The one nearest to her was beautiful, with lovely soft colours, and it told a real story. In the foreground stood the boy David, with his sling and his stones, and across a brook was the giant Goliath and the host of the Philistines. Dora knew that story, how David went forth alone and fought and defeated the giant. Above the picture were some words which Dora spelled out. Go, and the Lord be with thee. There was more about the window than just the picture. It had been given by Judge and Mrs. Winslow, whose son went away to fight in France and to help keep the world a safe place for little children to live. He did not come back, and so this was a new story window in the church where he used to go. Dora looked for a long time at the slender young David. He seemed such a boy to have done so much. Why? Had Mr. Thorne finished his sermon? Dora stood with the rest of the people. In a moment the choir would sing, and Uncle Dan was going to sing alone. Dora liked to hear her uncle's voice, and so did everybody else. She was pleased to see how attentively they listened, and that Mr. Thorne seemed to enjoy it too. All the time that Uncle Dan was singing, some gentlemen were taking the collection. Dora and Lucy put their pennies in the plate when Mr. Beckwith passed it to them, and then stood while the money was taken up to Mr. Thorne. Church was almost over. People would kneel again to pray, and then the choir would sing the last hymn and go out, and everybody would go home. When they were leaving the church, Dora felt somebody pat her cheek and put an arm about her. It was Olive Gates, and the two smiled at each other. They were pleased with Uncle Dan's music, but they did not need to speak of it. "What a cunning bear," said Olive, taking it in her hand. "Don't you like its green eyes?" asked Dora. "And it makes real little bear prints with its feet. I inked them on the indelible pad, and it's left little tracks on a piece of paper, just like a real bear." "What is its name?" asked Olive, just as Uncle Dan came beside them. Olive's face turned a pretty soft pink, and her eyes grew bright. Dora didn't answer. She had never thought of naming the bear, and this was a serious omission. All the afternoon she considered different names, but nothing that came into her mind seemed just right. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Robert Doolan. Board Game Basics Podcast. Chapter 9 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Doolan. Board Game Basics Podcast. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 9. The Vacation School. That Sunday evening, Uncle Dan, with the help of Dora's book and the organist at the church, discovered that Dora's bright star was called Arcturus. Dora was greatly pleased to know its name, and at once bestowed it upon her bear. Arcturus, she thought, had a wild sort of sound, befitting a free thing like a star or a bear. Surely there was nothing ordinary about the name. Monday morning, bright and early, Lucy and Dora started for the Lincoln School. On the way they were glad to meet Mary Barrows and Gladys Parr. When they reached the grounds, they found other girls they knew, and some they didn't, because they went to school in a different part of Westmore. In all, there were about 100 children, and there were 3 teachers besides 2 girls about 18 who had offered to help. Laura Carroll was one of these older girls, and with her stood the lady who had been on the Sunday school picnic and who thought Dora looked like somebody she knew. The lady's name was Miss Chandler, and she was to have charge of the vacation school. First, the children sang America and 1 or 2 other songs everybody knew. And then Miss Chandler asked all the girls 13 years old or more to form a group around Miss Smith. Those from 9 to 13 formed a second group, and the youngest children were left to make the third one. This arrangement separated Lucy and Dora, and at first neither of them liked it. To be sure, they were not in the same room at school, but that was different. Dora looked serious when Lucy's brown curls vanished in the older group, but she had only a moment to feel troubled. Miss Chandler herself came to the cluster of the youngest children. "Girls," she said cheerily, "how many of you can sew?" Dora was glad she could raise her hand. When she was 6, she learned to sew on buttons, and now she could hem and do over and over and outline very neatly. Miss Chandler explained that those who knew how were to work on something very interesting. She showed them small squares of pretty white cloth. Some had patterns of animals or children to be outlined. Others were to have flowers put on in cross-stitch. The completed squares were to be made into bedspreads. When the vacation school was over, these would be shown in the final exhibition and then given to the children's ward in the Brown Cottage hospital. Any little sick child would immediately feel better to have such a cover on his bed. Dora decided to take a flower square first. Later, she would do one in outline stitch. Laura Carroll started the flower and then gave it to Dora. She also gave her a piece of paper showing just how many crosses to make in each direction and what coloured cotton to use. Dora sat down on the grass to sew her flower. The smallest children of all were given kindergarten beads to string and tin moulds to use in the sandpile. Dora liked the flower pattern very much. It had 2 pink roses surrounded by green leaves. There were 2 shades of pink in the roses and 2 shades of green in the leaves. The older girls were making baskets, and the middle group clustered about the table with their teachers. Lucy held up a strip of khaki-coloured cloth. Dora wondered what it could be for. When the children had sewed about an hour, Miss Chandler told them to lay aside their work. All the groups stood in long lines, and Miss Smith and Laura Carroll showed them some pretty dancing steps, part of a Swedish folk dance. Miss Thornblum played on a violin for them to keep time, and all the girls practiced the steps. It was such fun that nobody wanted to stop. Even the little children left the slide and the sand pile and tried to dance. After the dancing, they played games. One group played Drop the Handkerchief, and the others chose different games. When they had played quite a long time, they went back to their sewing. Dora was glad to get back to her pretty cross-stitching. She had seen Lucy and learned that Lucy was making an Indian dress which was to have red fringe. Dora thought it would be nice to have such a dress, but she also liked to make the pink roses. Almost before anybody knew it, the clock in the church tower struck 11, and it was time to go home. Nobody could bear to have it 11 so soon, for the vacation school was such fun. and almost everybody begged to be allowed to take their squares to finish at home, but Miss Chandler said they must leave them to work on the next day. Later, they would make some clothes for their own dolls and might take those home to sew on. Each little girl was given a stout envelope into which to put her unfinished work, and on the outside Miss Chandler wrote their names. Dora was satisfied to know this plan. She had felt afraid that perhaps she might get somebody else's square, and she did not like forget-me-nots as well as roses. When she took her envelope to Miss Chandler to have her name put on it, Miss Chandler looked at her and smiled. "This is little, Dora, isn't it?" she asked. "I remember that you went on the Sunday school picnic." Dora smiled back, and Miss Chandler put an arm around her and gave her a little squeeze. "What a little duck you are," she said, "and you look so much like a friend I used to have." "Don't you have her now?" asked Dora. "She isn't living, dearie, but we used to be little girls together, and she had dimples in her cheeks just the way you have, and her eyes were like yours." Dora smiled again. She liked Miss Chandler very much. Then she went to find Lucy and walk home with her. Miss Chandler looked after her. "What a dear little thing she is," she said to Laura Carroll, who was putting away the sewing things. "She seems like a child who comes from a home where love is." "She does," said Laura. "Mrs. Merrill is very particular about Lucy and Dora. She tries very hard to bring them up nicely. You know the young man who sang the solo in church yesterday? He is Dora's uncle, and he thinks the world of her. Oh, Dora has plenty of love at home." "I never saw two sisters look less alike," said Miss Chandler. But Laura did not hear. She was taking the envelopes of sewing into the schoolhouse. Mrs. Merrill was interested in the vacation school and in what the girls were making. She thought the bed cover would be nice for sick babies, but she did not approve of Lucy's Indian dress. "It would be more sensible to sew something useful," she said. "I don't think much of clothes just to dress up in." "But I have all the clothes I need," said Lucy, "and it is such fun to sew on an Indian dress." "That may be," said her mother, "but if you don't need clothes yourself, there are plenty of children who do, and it seems a waste of time to make fancy things." Lucy didn't think so. Mother had forgotten how much fun it was just to dress up. When Father came at noon, Lucy was pleased that he did not think the Indian robe a waste of time. There seemed a difference in the way fathers felt about things. They only wanted little girls to have a very nice time, but mothers thought it was possible to have a nice time and to do something useful as well. That afternoon, Dora came to Mrs. Merrill as she sat sewing in the shady backyard. "May I go and change my library book?" she asked. "Yes," said Mrs. Merrill. "And may I stay at the library a while?" "Yes," said her mother again. "There is something else that I want to do," said Dora. "Something I want very much to do, Mother, and it is not teasing either, because I am only just asking about it. You know, the library lady said once she gave me a book about the Dutch children, and that she had been in Holland and seen them wearing their wooden shoes. Are you listening, Mother?" "Yes," said Mrs. Merrill, cutting a buttonhole in Lucy's new petticoat. "I am listening, child." "May I take the pink box with the bear and the other things and show her?" begged Dora. "Not if she is very busy, nor to bother her. If she should be in a hurry or writing, but only if she stops to smile at me, because perhaps she knows where the cunning baby and the fish came from and the little soldier. I want so much to know about them. Not to wear them, Mother, only just to ask her about them." Mrs. Merrill stopped sewing and thought a minute. She did not look at the petticoat nor at Dora, but at the poppies in the border. Dora turned to look at them. It seemed as though Mother did not like their colour, or else they were growing crookedly. "I am afraid there will be other children, Dora, and that they will want to look, and that you will get into trouble. Those things must not be lost. I will put the box in my pocket and not even take it out unless Miss Perkins is alone and not busy." "Very well," said Mrs. Merrill. "You may take it and ask her about them, but don't bother her if she is busy. And Lucy had better go with you." End of Chapter 9. Recording by Robert Doolan. Board Game Basics Podcast. Chapter 10 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Doolan. Board Game Basics Podcast. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. From Across the Ocean. When Dora and Lucy reached the library, they looked anxiously to see whether Miss Perkins was busy. She sat at her desk, talking to a lady who could not decide if she had read a certain book or not. The lady was looking at the pictures to see whether she remembered them. The children left their books to be taken off their cards and went to the shelves to choose some others. Dora kept watching Miss Perkins. The library had been open about an hour, and most of the people who were in a hurry had come and gone. There were no other children and not many grown-ups. If only Miss Perkins was not too busy, Dora had chosen a good time. She did not look too busy, but librarians always have to act as though they never had anything to do but to attend to whoever wants to talk with them. It would not be possible to decide how busy Miss Perkins was until the lady who couldn't remember had left the library. After a time, the lady did go out, and Dora watched anxiously to see what Miss Perkins did next. If she sat down at the typewriter or took a pen and paper, it was not the proper time to ask about Acturius and the other charms. But Miss Perkins did neither. She took a book from the desk and turned its pages over quite rapidly. The book was a large one with many pictures. The next moment she saw Dora looking wistfully at her, and she smiled. Dora knew that the moment had come. Touching Lucy to let her know, she went up to the desk. "Just see what a baby sister did to this book, Dora," said Miss Perkins, holding it so she could look. It was marked with pencil all over the story and the pictures too. "Babies are very destructive," sighed Miss Perkins. "Isn't it a pity, Dora, when they are so cunning as well? I don't know which does the most damage to books, a baby or a puppy." "Kittens are safer," said Dora. "They never hurt books." "One did once," said Miss Perkins. "It scratched the cover and bit the corner. At least, Alice thought her kitty did it." "What do you want to read today, Dora?" "I wanted to show you something," said Dora shyly. She took the pink box from her pocket and opened it. There was Acturius on his silver leash and the other charms on their tiny ring. Miss Perkins was interested. She admired them as much as Dora and Lucy hoped. "Of course the little shoe came from Holland," she said. "It is a sabot. We read about them in Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates," said Lucy eagerly. "Yes, we knew that," agreed Dora, "but I thought perhaps you could tell me where the others came from." "They have all crossed the Atlantic Ocean," said Miss Perkins, turning them over in her fingers. "Yes, I think I can tell you where they probably came from." "The little heart?" asked Lucy. "That came from Italy," said Miss Perkins. "Either from Venice or Naples. Probably from Naples. That is a city in the southern part of Italy, you know, which is famous for its coral. The fishermen get it from the Mediterranean Sea when the coral poulps make it. Sometimes it is pink and sometimes red." "I have a string of red coral," said Lucy. "It belongs to Mother, but she lets me wear it." "Red coral is very pretty," said Miss Perkins. "When the coral is fished up, it is rough and branching, but the workmen make smooth beads and ornaments from it. Once in a while they find some that is almost white with just a tiny little pink. That is rather rare. The tiny broken pieces of coral are made into little charms and trinkets, and this pink heart is one. Yes, I am sure that the heart came from Naples. And where did Arcturus come from? Asked Dora. Arcturus? Oh, is he the bear? Dora explained how the bear got his name, and Miss Perkins looked amused. It is a very nice name for a bear, she agreed. Arcturus, I think, came from Switzerland, where the high Alps are. You have read Heidi, haven't you? That tells about the Alps. There used to be a great many wild bears in the mountains, and the capital city of the country is called Bern, which means a bear. In Bern there are stone bears ornamenting many of the buildings and fountains, and there is a quite wonderful clock on the main street of the city. Every hour when the clock strikes, a procession of little bears come out of the clock on this high tower. When the bell sounds, a cock flaps his wings and crows, and the procession of bears marches around a figure of old Father Time. Then they go back inside the clock to wait until it strikes again. In a deep pit the city keeps some live bears, and the children look down at them and feed them with buns. All the tourists go to see those bears. In the shops are all sorts of bears for sale. Gingerbread bears and white candy bears with red sugar tongues, and wooden bears of every size, and tiny gold or silver bears like Arcturus. But I never saw one before with green eyes. They are usually red. Perhaps the person who bought this bear had him made with green ones. Miss Perkins had to stop to find a book for a gentleman who wanted to know how to keep the moles out of his cucumber bed. Lucy and Dora thought this a funny thing to ask, but Miss Perkins did not seem to think it odd. She gave the man a book at once, which told him just what to do about the moles, and then she came back to the children. This pretty little fish, she went on, must be a salmon, for they are that colour, and it came from Norway, where the fishermen catch so many salmon, and where people go on purpose to fish in the Norwegian rivers. I bought a fish very much like this in the city of Bergen, in Norway. I am sure it must have come from there. Where did the little soldier come from? Asked Dora. See, his sword moves back and forth. For a great many years the English soldiers wore scarlet uniforms, said Miss Perkins. I have seen them often, marching or on guard in their bright-coloured clothes. During the Great War they did not wear them, because you can understand that a scarlet coat like this can be seen a long distance away. This little soldier is an English officer, as he used to be, and he must have come from some garrison town in England. And where did the last one come from? Asked Dora, showing the little silver baby. That also came from Italy, said Miss Perkins. It is a bambino. That is the Italian word for baby. Many years ago, in the city of Florence, a home or hospital was built for sick children, and for children who didn't have any parents to take care of them. A very famous artist named Luca della Robbia made some beautiful decorations for the outside of the building, all of little children. This is a copy of one of the babies on his medallions. Miss Perkins brought a book which showed the Luca della Robbia babies. She knew exactly where to go for it, just as she had found the one that told about the moles. Lucy and Dora thought it wonderful that she should know in which book to look. There were a great many books in the Westmore Public Library. Miss Perkins showed them the picture of the hospital and the round medallion set above the portico. They saw for themselves the babies, wrapped in long pieces of cloth wound round and round, which Miss Perkins said were called swaddling clothes. They found the very one the silver baby looked like, but they agreed that the modern baby clothes are more comfortable for the babies. Dora was delighted to hear about the charms. She had felt so sure that Miss Perkins would know where they came from. Miss Perkins did another thing that was kind. She took a piece of paper and wrote on it the little charms, and the names of the cities and countries they came from. Will you please write the baby's Italian name? Asked Dora. Miss Perkins did so. Then she gave Dora the paper to put in the pink box. They finished talking about the charms just in time, because a number of people came to change their books, and Miss Perkins was busy. But Lucy and Dora were perfectly satisfied. They chose their own books and then went back to the desk to have them charged. Dora slid around the desk close to Miss Perkins. "Thank you very much," she said. "Mother told me not to ask you if you were busy and not to bother you." "I didn't bother, did I?" "Not a bit," said Miss Perkins, smiling again. "I am very glad that I could tell you, Dora. And I am glad that you have the little charms. Any girl is fortunate to own them." When the children left the library, they ran all the way home. They were so eager to tell Mother about the charms. As they told her the story of each, she looked at it again, but she did not say much. And when Dora went to put the pink box safely away, Mrs. Merrill stopped sewing on Lucy's petticoat. For as much as 5 minutes she looked at the poppies with her hands lying quite idle in her lap. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Robert Doolan. Board Game Basics Podcast.
Chapter 11 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 11. A Rainy Day. One morning about a week later, the sun did not shine and the east wind blew. The weather was so much cooler that Mrs. Merrill decided to visit the city to do some shopping. Lately, every day had been too warm to go. Even if it rained, as seemed likely, she would rather have the rain than try to shop on a hot day. "I shall not be home for dinner," she said to the children, "so you must get it for Father. Uncle Dan is working so far away that he is going to take his dinner with him. I will leave everything ready, and when you come in at 11, there will be plenty of time for you to attend to it." Mrs. Merrill told Lucy exactly what to do about dinner. She told Dora to set the table and to help Lucy all she could. Then she gave them a key to the door and went away to catch the car for the city. The children locked the house carefully and started for the vacation school. They took an umbrella, but they did not wear rubbers. Mother had not said anything about rubbers. Before they had gone far, a few drops began to fall, and when they reached the Lincoln School, it was really raining. Tables and seats were wet, and the sand castles the little children left from the day before were flat on top and pitted with round holes where raindrops struck. The vacation school would have to move into the building, which was quite exciting, for every day had been so pleasant that the children could stay outdoors. Lucy's group was working in one of the big classrooms, and Dora found hers in the kindergarten room. This was more fun than a regular schoolroom where the children were obliged to sit at desks, because the kindergarten chairs could be moved about. Since the groups were scattered in different rooms, they did not sing together this morning. Each group sang a little while by itself before beginning work. Long ago, Dora had finished the rosebud square. She had made 2 in outline, though she did not like them so well. But when Miss Chandler said she did the first one very nicely, Dora really felt obliged to take another, though she preferred to cross-stitch. Then she had sewed another rosebud square, and yesterday finished one with forget-me-nots. This morning her sewing envelope was empty. After the singing, Miss Chandler began to give out the work. "These are the last squares," she said. "Next, the squares are to be sewed together, and that must be done by somebody who sews very neatly." Miss Chandler looked around the room. 3 strips are already basted," she went on. "Mary may have one to work on, and Anne may take the second, and Dora may sew the third one." Dora felt extremely proud to be chosen for this honor. Laura Carroll gave her a thimble and a slim needle with a long tail of thread. She set the first stitch for Dora and then watched while Dora took some more. "That's right," she said. "You do it nicely, Dora." Dora stuck the needle in with great care. No baby who slept under that strip of squares should ever feel the wind blowing between the stitches. Another pleasant thing happened that morning. Outside, the rain beat on the windows, and inside sat the circle of little girls with their pretty sewing. Because of the storm, the smallest children had not come. Miss Chandler sat down in a kindergarten chair too, and in her hand she held a storybook. "I am going to read aloud," she said. "Miss Laura will sit beside me, and if anybody wants help, let her raise her hand quietly so as not to interrupt the reading, and Miss Laura will come to her and whisper what to do." The story was so interesting that nobody wanted to practice dancing when the time came, but Miss Chandler said they would all feel better if they did get up and move around, and that she would go on reading when the exercise was over. So everybody went out in the long corridor. To dance in the hall proved fun. Sometimes for music they had a victrola, and sometimes a fiddle. Today it was the victrola, and Miss Thorburn helped with the steps. Some of the children could dance very nicely now, and these were taken on one side to learn more steps. Dora was one of them. She did not need anyone to teach her how to dance. Her toes knew of their own accord. When school broke up at 11, the rain was coming down in sheets. Lucy and Dora wished they had worn their rubbers. They knew all the time that they should have done so. "Let's go home barefooted," Lucy suggested. Dora looked shocked. "Mother never lets us take off our shoes and stockings," she said, "except when we go to the beach for a day, or just on the grass in the backyard." "I know it," said Lucy. "I wouldn't do it just for fun without asking her. But shoes cost so much, and yours are almost new. It will spoil them to get wet." "I heard Father and Mother talking about how much shoes cost now. It isn't being naughty, Dora." Dora agreed that it would never do to spoil her new shoes, but walking barefooted was not so much fun after all. The mud felt unpleasant, and there were pricky places in the sidewalk. When they reached home, they had to wash their feet, and then hurry to get dinner for Father. He would come very promptly at 12, because he had only to cross the street from the printing office. Lucy lighted the oven of the gas stove. Mother had left in it a glass baking dish with scalloped hominy, all ready to bake. There were meatballs to cook on a frying pan, and cabbage salad. Dora set the table neatly and put the salad on plates and the dressing in a bowl. She put on the bread and the butter and the salt, and got the water pitcher ready to fill when Father came. For dessert there was a cherry pie. When the whistles blew at 12, everything was ready. The meatballs smelled so good that Lucy felt quite proud of her cooking. On top, the hominy had turned a beautiful golden brown. They did not know whether Father would want some coffee. Uncle Dan liked it for dinner, but Mr. Merrill did not always drink it. "Look in the refrigerator, Dora," said Lucy, "and see if there is any cold coffee. Sometimes Father likes it cold." Dora was peering into the refrigerator where she did not see any coffee when there was a crash and a cry from Lucy. Dora turned quickly. There on the floor lay the dish of hominy. "Oh my," said Dora, coming to the stove. "Oh dear," said Lucy, and she looked as though she was going to cry. They both stood staring at it. The dish was broken into a great many pieces, and the nice scalloped hominy was oozing over the floor. "Let's take off the top," said Dora, "into another dish. The top hasn't been on the floor, and perhaps it will be enough for dinner." Lucy brought 2 spoons and another dish, and they carefully took off the top part of the hominy. It was perfectly clean and good to eat, but there was a discouraging mess on the floor. "That was Mother's glass baking dish she likes so much," said Lucy mournfully. "You didn't mean to break it," comforted Dora. "She won't scold because it was an accident." Just then Father came. He was glad that Lucy had not dropped the hot hominy on her feet, and said that the oven was too high for her to manage easily. In order to reach it, she had been obliged to stand on her toes. He also said that the top of the hominy was not hurt, and that it would be enough for dinner. Then he took a spoon and a pie plate, and scraped up the mess on the floor, and all the broken glass. Lucy brought a wet cloth, and nobody would have known there had been an accident. After dinner, Father went back to his work, and the children cleared the table. They did not know what to do with the plate of broken glass and hominy. They took out all the big pieces of glass and rinsed them and put them in the ash can, but there was the hominy, quite full of bits and splinters of glass. To put it in the garbage pail would never do. Broken glass could not possibly be good for Mr. Cassidy's pigs that would eat the garbage. "I know," said Lucy. "Let's put the pan out in the rain. It will wash out the hominy for the birds to eat, and the glass is heavy and will stay in the bottom of the plate. Then we can throw it away." Dora thought this was a good plan. Timothy had already turned up his nose at the hominy, and Mrs. Eli would not eat it by mistake. Cats did not like hominy. They set the pan in the yard and washed the dishes, talking all the time about the vacation school. Lucy's teacher had read aloud to her group while they sewed, but a different story. They told each other the stories they had heard. That was one nice thing about being in different groups. The dishes were nearly done when a dreadful thought came into Dora's mind. She almost dropped a plate. "Lucy," she said, "there is Toby. Do you think he would eat that glass?" Lucy looked out the window. Toby was a friendly collie who belonged to the druggist. He was not grown up enough to know that he should not go around in other people's yards looking for food. Not once had the children thought of Toby, only of the cats. Now he was there in the yard. Lucy dropped the dishcloth and ran to the door. The pie plate was absolutely clean. Hominy, broken glass, rainwater, all were gone. "Oh dear," said Lucy again. "Toby has eaten that glass, and it will kill him." This seemed more than they could bear. They were fond of Toby, who was a very nice dog, and polite to Timothy, and Mr. Giddings, the druggist, was always kind to them. Only the other day, when they went to buy some toothpaste for Mother, he gave them each a pretty tin box. "How soon will it kill him?" asked Dora, almost ready to cry. "I don't know," said Lucy. She sat down in a chair, and really did cry. To break the dish was bad enough. To have Toby eat the bits of glass was really too much. "If we tell Mr. Giddings, perhaps he can give Toby some medicine so he won't die," said Dora. "He will say we ought not to have put the plate in the yard. I did think of Timothy and Mrs. Eli, but not of Toby." "It is our backyard," said Dora. "Toby was not invited to come into it. I will tell Mr. Giddings, Lucy. I don't think he will be cross, and if he knows, he can give Toby some medicine in time." Lucy did not want to go, but she knew something ought to be done, and that it was not fair to let Dora go alone. So they put on their rubbers and ran over to the drugstore to speak to Mr. Giddings. Mr. Giddings was not at all cross. He was not a cross man anyway, and the children were crying. "Bless you," said he when they had told him. "That won't hurt Toby. Think of all the sticks he chews up and the splinters he swallows. I don't believe it will do him one mite of harm, but I'll give him some medicine just to make sure it doesn't. I'm glad you came to tell me. Now don't feel badly about it any longer. Toby shouldn't go around eating things he isn't expected to find." Mr. Giddings spoke so kindly and smiled so pleasantly that the children felt much better. Now that she knew Toby would not be any the worse for his queer lunch, Dora thought his eating it was really rather funny. Uncle Dan would think so. When Mother came, Lucy had still to tell her about the broken dish, but that was a small matter since Toby was no longer in danger of sudden death. Mother never scolded for things that were accidents. The oven had been high, and the dish was very hot, and Lucy's hands were small. Mrs. Merrill said she was sorry about the dish, but it was lucky Lucy had not been burned. She also said she did not mind their coming home barefoot, since it was to save their shoes. When Uncle Dan heard about Toby and the glass, as Dora expected, he laughed a long time. "Toby must have a patent leather inside," he said, "or else he is a circus dog." "He could be one," said Dora. "Mr. Giddings has taught him to sneeze when he wants anything. One day I saw Toby chase a squirrel up a tree, and then he stood at the bottom of the tree and sneezed for the squirrel to come down again." "Did it come for his sneezing?" asked Uncle Dan. "It did not," said Dora. "It jumped into another tree, and Toby didn't see it go, so he stood and sneezed till he was tired, and then he went home." End of Chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Campbell Schelp. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 12, The Last Saturday. Every Sunday morning, Mr. Merrill gave Lucy $50 for the next week of the vacation school, and every Sunday morning Uncle Dan dropped another down Dora's back. She did not like to feel it going down, but since it pleased Uncle Dan to do it, Dora felt obliged not to wiggle more than she could help. But she always shook it out as soon as possible. One day when they reached the Lincoln School, the children found the other girls and the teachers feeling quite disturbed. Some rough big boys had come into the playground and thrown over the tables and the benches and broken the supports to the little slide the little children liked. That day everybody had to sit on the grass, either to sew or to make baskets. Miss Chandler said she would have the seats and tables mended, but it was hard to find anyone to do it. All the carpenters were very busy. That night Dora told Uncle Dan what had happened. At the time he did not say anything. But Dora was not a bit surprised when Uncle Dan came next morning to the vacation school. "I heard you wanted a little help," he said to Miss Chandler. "My boss has let me off for an hour or so to see what I can do for you." Miss Chandler was delighted to have him help, and Dora felt extremely proud of Uncle Dan. He did not speak either to her or to Lucy, but went to work repairing the damage the big boys had done. He set up the tables and nailed the benches together, and then he looked at the supports for the slide. It would not do to patch them up, because if they should break while the little ones were playing, somebody might be hurt. Uncle Dan put in 2 new posts for the side. "I am very grateful to you for coming," said Miss Chandler. "I tried everywhere to find somebody to mend the things, but every man I asked said he could not do anything until next week. It means a great deal to the children to have it done so soon. Now, just send your bill to the Improvement Society, and I will see that it is paid." "There won't be any bill," said Uncle Dan. "My 2 little nieces are here, and you do enough for them, so I guess it won't hurt me to drive a few nails for you." Miss Chandler looked quite surprised. "Thank you very much," she said, and then she held out her hand. Uncle Dan took it solemnly and lifted his cap as he went away, but as he passed Dora, he winked at her. It had been part of the fun that they should pretend not to know each other, but most of the girls knew Uncle Dan and quite envied Lucy and Dora because he had come to make things right at the playground. By this time the cross-stitch spread was finished and it was really beautiful. All the teachers said so. Dora had sewed 2 of its long seams and done them very nicely indeed. Now she was making a dress for her doll. Lucy's Indian robe was completed, even to the fringe, and she was practicing for the Indian dance her group was to give. Never were 6 weeks so short before. The girls could hardly believe it when they realized that the vacation school was almost over. All their work was to be on exhibition, and then would follow the dances and a play by the older girls. All the fathers and mothers were invited, and Miss Chandler sent a special invitation to Uncle Dan because he had mended the broken tables. But Uncle Dan and Father Merrill did not have time to go to the entertainment, only Mrs. Merrill. Lucy wore her Indian dress because she was to take part in that dance, and she put on her coral beads. They seemed quite suited to the occasion. Dora wore a white dress and white stockings and black slippers. She also wore a blue sash and arcturus. All the girls in the Swedish dance were to be dressed in white, and when they reached the school they would be given pretty colored headdresses. Quite a crowd had gathered that last Saturday afternoon. The baskets and the 2 bed covers and the dolls' dresses and baby clothes were spread on the tables for the visitors to look at and admire. Each girl wanted her mother to see what she had made. Some of the children had done modeling in clay, and were feeling very proud of their work. Mary Barrows had made a flat sort of picture of her little sister, and it was so like a baby that Miss Chandler showed it to all the ladies and gentlemen who had come to the exhibition to see what the children could accomplish in the vacation school. Mrs. Merrill looked carefully at the spreads. Dora pointed out the squares she had cross-stitched or outlined, and the long seams she had sewed, and also the clothes Lucy had made for her doll. Mrs. Merrill felt glad she had taught the children to sew. She liked the tiny ducks Dora had made from clay. They looked as though at any moment they might quack themselves away. When all the mothers had looked at the sewing and the baskets and clay figures, they sat down on settees to watch the entertainment. First came Lucy's Indian dance, with all the girls dressed in their fringed robes and decorated with strings of beads. No one but Lucy wore a coral string, and Dora thought it looked very pretty. After the Indian dance, the older girls gave their play. They had practiced it inside the schoolhouse, and none of the children had yet seen it, so everybody was interested to sit on the grass and watch. It was an outdoor play and told how a little girl named Hope wandered off and met a bluebird, who was just going to wake the flowers and plants in the spring. Hope went with him and saw him call the different growing things. First, the useful plants like wheat and corn and sugar and potatoes, and then the different flowers, the violet and forget-me-not and daisy and apple blossom. Each was represented by a little girl who came and talked with Hope and the bluebird and ended by reciting a poem. The bluebird was very funny in some of his remarks, advising the apple blossoms not to rent any nests to the English sparrows because they were so dirty and quarrelsome, and thinking he might take one himself since the rent had not gone up since the previous spring, when it was to eat all the cankerworms and let the bees alone. The potato was comical too, because she was so discouraged with the way inexperienced people planted her too deep, and with all the bugs that sat on her leaves and tasted them. The audience liked the play. It was funny and bright, and yet there were things that made you stop and think, as when the forget-me-not said she was going to cover all the battlefields of Europe with a pretty blue carpet, so that men would remember not to start another war. Next came Dora's dance, and she left her mother and Lucy and ran to the place Miss Chandler wanted the girls. The dance was very pretty, and Dora and Amy Connor danced alone before the others. Dora was pleased that she could do this, for she thought her mother would like to see her. Mrs. Merrill did like to watch her, and she also thought that Dora did it better than any of the other girls, better even than Amy. Dancing seemed to come very easily to Dora. Some of the other people thought so too, and when the girls had drilled and marched and the entertainment was over, they told Mrs. Merrill how well Dora had done. Mrs. Merrill liked them to say so, but she thought it of more importance that Dora could sew nicely. The Village Improvement Society had a surprise for everybody who had come to the last Saturday. Ice cream cones appeared, for the visitors as well as for the children. This made a nice ending for the vacation school. After the cones were eaten, the people began to go home, but Dora begged her mother to wait a moment. She was extremely anxious to show Arcturus to Miss Chandler. This was the first time Arcturus had come to the vacation school, and he came only because Dora wore her best white dress and was in one of the dances. Mrs. Merrill said she could not wait because she must go home to get supper, but that she would walk slowly. Mrs. Soames was going her way. Dora might show the bear to Miss Chandler, and she and Lucy could overtake them. Dora had to wait several minutes for Miss Chandler, who was talking to some visitors, but finally her chance came. "Well, Dora," said Miss Chandler, turning to her at last, "it is goodbye, isn't it? But I hope to come to Westmore again next summer, and, dear me, Dora, you'll be 9 years old then, and I can't have you in my group." "Perhaps you could take the second group next summer," Dora suggested. "Perhaps I could," laughed Miss Chandler. "We've had such a good time together, haven't we?" Miss Chandler put an arm about Dora, and then she saw Arcturus. "What a darling silver bear," she said. "Did somebody bring him to you from Switzerland?" She turned Arcturus over and saw his pretty green eyes. Dora was looking down at the bear. "I wanted you to see him," she said. "Mother lets me wear him only once in a while, because he must never be lost. Miss Perkins says all the silver bears she saw in Switzerland had red eyes. She never saw one before with green eyes." Miss Chandler did not say anything at all. She looked at Arcturus, and she looked at Dora, and then she looked at Lucy, who had run up to say goodbye, and to tell Dora it was time to go home. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Campbell Schelp. Chapter 13 of The Silver Bear. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Campbell Schelp. The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown. Chapter 13, Dora's Name. "Who gave you the little bear, Dora?" Miss Chandler asked after quite a long time. "I don't know," said Dora. "I had it when I came to Father and Mother. It was on a ring with 5 other little things." Miss Chandler looked very much puzzled. "I don't understand," she said. "Haven't you always lived with Father and Mother?" "She came to us in a big red automobile," explained Lucy. "Uncle Dan and I pretended it was a chariot of fire, but she is just the same as ours now." Miss Chandler asked the children to wait for her. She talked with Laura Carroll for a few minutes. Then she came back to Lucy and Dora. "Dora, dearie," she said, "what were the other little things on your ring?" "A fish," said Dora. "Miss Perkins said it was a salmon and came from Norway. An English soldier, a pink coral heart from Naples, a Dutch sabot, and an Italian bambino from Florence." Miss Chandler put an arm about Dora and looked at her very hard. Then she kissed Dora, much to her surprise, and patted Lucy's curls. "Tell your mother I am coming to see her by and by," she said. Lucy gave Mrs. Merrill the message. "This evening?" asked Mrs. Merrill quite sharply, but Lucy did not know. "John, I want you to be here," said Mrs. Merrill. "I'll be here," said her husband, "but Molly, I don't see any cause for you to be disturbed." "A man wouldn't," said Mrs. Merrill. When Miss Chandler came, for she did come that very evening, just as the shadows were growing long, Mr. Thorne was with her. The children were surprised to see him, but evidently their mother was not. After they had greeted the visitors, she told the children to go down to the fruit store and buy some lemons. "You need not hurry back," she said. Lucy and Dora did not hurry. They were not often permitted to go down after supper to where the stores were, and it was exciting to be a part of the Saturday crowd. Almost 3/4 of an hour passed before they came back. Mr. Thorne and Miss Chandler were still sitting in the yard with their parents, and Miss Chandler and their mother looked as though they had been crying. But both Mr. and Mrs. Merrill looked very happy. "Come here, Dora," said Mr. Thorne. "Would you like to hear a story?" Dora liked nothing better. She settled herself at once on the rector's knee. Lucy sat on the grass at his feet. "Once upon a time," began Mr. Thorne, "there was a little girl who lived with her father and mother in the far west, in Colorado. Her father was an engineer who knew about mines, and he was busy helping a mining company get silver out of the rocks. The camp where they lived was very small, and the water they had to drink was not good. By and by, most of the people in the camp were sick, and many of them died, among them the little girl's father and mother. There were no other women in the camp, and most of the men were sick. One day, when things were at their worst, a man with a big automobile came through the camp because he had lost his way and blundered there by mistake. The little girl's father had left a note, asking that she be taken to his old aunt who lived in Massachusetts, so the miners begged the man in the automobile, whose name was Brent, to take the child with him. Mr. Brent said he would take her to the nearest city and send somebody east with her. "What was her name?" asked Lucy. Mr. Thorne hesitated a second. Then he looked straight at Dora. "Her name was Theodora Jodwin," he said. Dora looked surprised. Somehow the name seemed one she had heard before. "When Mr. Brent reached the nearest town," the rector went on, "he sent a doctor and nurses to help the sick people in the camp, but he finally decided that he would take the little girl all the way east with him in the big car. He found a kind woman who very much wanted to visit her sister, living near Boston. She said she would take care of Theodora on the journey. Mr. Jodwin's aunt lived in a town not far from here, but Mr. Brent did not write her that he was bringing Theodora. Perhaps he thought somebody else had done so, perhaps he did not know just when he could get there, for of course he was a long time on the way. On the very last day of the journey, he left the kind woman at her sister's house and started for Brookton alone with Theodora. It was only a short distance he had to go, but while he was driving he felt so ill that he stopped at a druggist's, at Mr. Gidding's store across on the corner. There was something the matter with his heart, and he did not get well. He never had a chance to tell the people who tried to help him about Theodora. "Who do you think she is, Lucy?" "Our Dora?" asked Lucy. Her eyes were big with surprise. "Your Dora now," said Mr. Thorne, "but she is really Theodora Jodwin." Dora slid off Mr. Thorne's knee. She went straight to Mrs. Merrill and put her arms around her neck. "I am Dora Merrill," she said, and then she laid her head down on Mother's shoulder. "So you are," said Mr. Thorne. "So you shall stay. But there is more to the story." Lucy looked at Dora, who turned one ear so she could hear. She was not going to look at Mr. Thorne again. Mr. Jodwin's aunt in Brookton did not know Theodora was coming, and for a long time she did not know what happened to her nephew and niece, and then nobody could tell what had become of Theodora. But the aunt was a very old lady, so it did not worry her as much as it might have done had she been younger and realized fully what a sad thing it would be if Theodora did not find people to love her. By and by the old aunt died, too. Theodora's mother had a dear friend. They grew up together and loved each other very much. This friend lived in Europe for a number of years, and she once sent to little Theodora a ring with 6 tiny charms. Dora lifted her hand. "Arcturus?" she asked. "And the Bambino and the others?" "Just those," said Mr. Thorne. And so when Miss Chandler found a little girl who looked so much like Gertrude Jodwin, and who wore a silver bear with green eyes, like one which Miss Chandler had made purposely because all the other bears were red-eyed, and when this same little girl had the other charms Miss Chandler selected because she thought any little girl would like them, why, you see, it grew very easy to find out what had become of Theodora Jodwin. "Mr. Thorne," said Lucy, "Dora doesn't have to go away from us, does she?" "No, indeed," said Mr. Thorne. "There is nobody for her to go to. Neither her father nor her mother had any other relatives. The old auntie left a little money for Theodora, if she could ever be found. Not very much money, but enough to give Dora music lessons now if she likes, and Mother thinks best, and perhaps to send her to normal school or even to college when she is old enough to go." "I am glad," said Lucy. "So glad that the chariot of fire didn't stop in some other town on its way to Brookston." "So am I," said Dora, giving Mother a great hug. She hugged Father too. Then, because Miss Chandler looked as though she would like to be hugged also, Dora did it. "Thank you for Arcturus and the other charms," she said. Miss Chandler kissed her. "You must call me Aunt Margaret," she said. "Lucy shall too, and we will write to each other. I was very fond of your mother, little Dora, and if you did not have a home where people loved you, I should be glad to take you myself. Mother says you may visit me sometimes." "There is something I want to ask you," said Dora. "Do you know when my really truly birthday is? Lucy's is in May, but I was too little to remember when mine was, so Mother said we would call it the 17th of September, the day when I came here to live." "I'll tell you a secret," said Miss Chandler. "Your birthday is just the same as mine, and both of them are on September 15th. Mother guessed very nearly right, Dora." When Mrs. Merrill came to tuck Lucy and Dora into bed that night, she gave Dora an especially loving kiss. "Mother," said Dora, "the 6 little charms are really mine now, aren't they?" "Yes," said Mrs. Merrill. "Then may I give Lucy the pink heart?" You may lend it to her, said Mrs. Merrill. There is one thing more, Dora went on. For every day I should like to say Dora, but do you think on Sundays and times when I wear a rectoress I might be called Theodora? It is such an important sounding name. I think you might, said Mrs. Merrill. And now you may write it Theodora Jodwin Merrill. You see, we adopted you and gave you our name. Mr. Thorne says that Theodora means the gift of God. Father and I feel that you really are one to us. Perhaps the chariot of fire truly came from heaven, said Dora. Perhaps it did, said Mrs. Merrill. End of chapter 13. Recording by Campbell Schelp. End of The Silver Bear by Edna Adelaide Brown.